The coffee cup slipped from Ayanna Whitefeather's weathered hands, shattering against the porch boards as she stared through the swirling smoke and flames that surrounded her remote Cherokee reservation cabin. 4 massive bobcats, each weighing 40 pounds of pure mountain muscle, had formed a protective circle around her frail 72-year-old body, their golden eyes reflecting the inferno that should have meant certain death. This wasn't how wild animals behaved. Sarah Moonwalker's scream pierced the night air as she watched from the tree line, her cell phone clattering to the forest floor. Tommy Riversong grabbed his radio with trembling fingers, his voice cracking as he called for emergency backup that might arrive too late. Ayanna's silver braids whipped in the superheated wind as she pressed her palm against Atlas's massive head, the same gentle touch she'd used 3 years ago when he was a starving, orphaned kitten no bigger than her fist. The irony cut deeper than the smoke burning her lungs. The creatures she'd saved were now saving her. "How did we get here?" she whispered, as the flames closed in and her wild family refused to abandon their human mother. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The story begins 3 years earlier, in the heart of the Cherokee Reservation, where the Smoky Mountains cradle secrets as old as the wind itself. Ayanna Whitefeather had spent 72 years learning that life rarely unfolds according to plan, but she never expected her final chapter to be written by 4 orphaned bobcat cubs. Her 15-acre homestead sat like a weathered prayer bead on the mountain's eastern slope, where her late husband Walter had built their log cabin in 1952 with his own calloused hands. The structure had weathered countless storms, much like Ayanna herself, silver-haired, Cherokee-featured, with kind brown eyes that held depths of both sorrow and strength. At 5 feet 2 inches, arthritis had bent her frame slightly forward, but her spirit remained unbowed despite 8 years of widowhood. The cabin's interior told the story of a life lived fully. Walter's hand-carved furniture, Cherokee pottery passed down through generations, and framed photographs of the children they'd fostered over the years. Ayanna had never been blessed with biological children. A miscarriage at 25 had ended those dreams, but her heart had mothered dozens of reservation kids who needed temporary homes. As a registered nurse at Cherokee Indian Hospital for 40 years, she'd delivered babies, held dying hands, and witnessed every shade of human experience. Now retirement stretched before her like an empty road. Her Social Security check of $1,247 each month barely covered the reverse mortgage payments and medication costs. Sarah Moonwalker, her niece and closest living relative, lived 45 minutes away in Asheville, working as a social worker and raising 2 teenage sons alone after her divorce. Sarah visited weekly, always with the same gentle pressure. "Aunt Ayanna, you shouldn't be living out here alone. What if something happens?" The reservation community respected Ayanna as an elder, but progress had changed everything. The casino's success had brought wealth to some families while leaving others behind. Land developers circled like vultures, offering enormous sums for mountain property. Richard Stormcrow, a wealthy Cherokee businessman who'd built an empire in gaming and real estate, had been particularly persistent about her acreage, though Ayanna sensed something darker beneath his interest. Tommy Riversong, the 34-year-old wildlife officer assigned to her district, checked on her monthly. Mixed Cherokee and European ancestry had given him striking features and a deep connection to both worlds. He'd lost his parents in a car accident at 16 and understood the ache of solitude that sometimes crept into Ayanna's voice during their conversations. Each morning, Ayanna tended her traditional medicine garden, growing white sage, sweetgrass, and tobacco according to her grandmother's teachings. She'd inherited not just the land, but the responsibility to maintain Cherokee healing traditions. The irony wasn't lost on her. a trained Western nurse who found equal truth in ancient plant medicine. On the morning that would change everything, she was kneeling among the emerging spring shoots, her arthritic fingers coaxing life from the mountain soil, when a desperate crying echoed from the nearby woods. The sound was neither human nor familiar, but it spoke directly to her maternal heart with an urgency that demanded immediate response. The crying grew more desperate as Ayana pushed through the underbrush, her arthritic knees protesting each uneven step. 50 yards from her cabin, beneath a cluster of mountain laurel, she discovered a scene that would haunt her for the rest of her days. 4 bobcat kittens no bigger than house cats huddled beside their mother's still form. Their eyes were barely open, their spotted coats matted with morning dew, and their tiny voices carried the unmistakable desperation of orphaned creatures facing certain death. The mother bobcat lay motionless, her beautiful tawny coat unmarked by any visible injury. Ayana knelt beside the body, her trained nurse's eye immediately recognizing the telltale signs of poisoning, the foam around the mouth, the rigid muscles, the sweet almond scent that suggested cyanide-based compounds. Someone had deliberately placed poisoned bait in these woods, and this protective mother had paid the ultimate price for trying to feed her family. "Oh, sweet babies," Ayana whispered in Cherokee, her voice thick with emotion. The largest kitten, a male with distinctive dark markings around his eyes, crawled toward the sound of her voice. His siblings followed weakly, their movements unsteady and desperate. They were perhaps 3 weeks old, still dependent on their mother's milk, and without intervention, they would be dead within hours. Federal law was crystal clear about keeping wild animals, especially predators like bobcats. Ayana knew the penalties: hefty fines, possible jail time, and the immediate confiscation of the animals. But as she watched the smallest female kit struggle to lift her head, professional ethics warred with maternal instinct. These weren't statistics or case studies. They were living beings whose only crime was being born into a world that had suddenly turned hostile. She thought of Walter, gone 8 years now, and how he'd always said she had too much room in her heart for strays. He'd meant it as gentle teasing about the countless animals she'd nursed back to health over the decades: injured owls, orphaned raccoons, even a black bear cub they'd secretly rehabilitated before releasing it deep in the national forest. But looking at these 4 helpless creatures, Ayana wondered if perhaps that oversized heart had been preparing her for this moment all along. The decision made itself. She pulled off her cotton shawl and carefully wrapped the kittens against her chest, feeling their rapid heartbeats and hearing their weak mewing sounds. The walk back to the cabin felt eternal, each step weighted with the knowledge that she was crossing a line from which there would be no return. At 72, with limited income and failing health, she was about to become a mother again, this time to 4 wild predators who would grow to 30 pounds each and possess all the instincts of their mountain heritage. Inside the cabin, Ayana's nursing training took over. She prepared a makeshift nursery in the spare bedroom, using cardboard boxes lined with old towels and positioning heating pads on low settings to replicate their mother's warmth. From her pantry, she mixed goat milk with corn syrup and a raw egg, creating a formula that would sustain them until she could drive to town for proper kitten milk replacer. The cost would strain her fixed income, but that was tomorrow's problem. As she fed each kitten with a small syringe, their tiny paws kneading against her hands in the universal gesture of nursing young, Ayana found herself naming them, despite knowing that attachment would make their eventual release more painful. The largest male, with his protective instincts already evident as he positioned himself between his siblings and any perceived threat, became Atlas. The most alert female, whose bright eyes seemed to catalog every detail of her new environment, earned the name Luna. The adventurous male who explored every corner of the box became River, while the smallest female, whose gentle nature reminded Ayanna of her grandmother's wisdom, became sage. That first night, Ayanna slept fitfully on the spare room floor, setting her alarm for every 2 hours to maintain the feeding schedule that would keep them alive. Between feedings, she watched them sleep in a pile of tiny spotted fur and listened to their contented purring sounds. The weight of her decision pressed down like the mountain air. She was harboring federal contraband, spending money she couldn't afford, and risking her freedom for 4 creatures who might not survive despite her best efforts. But as dawn broke over the Cherokee reservation and the kittens stirred for their morning feeding, Ayanna felt something she hadn't experienced since Walter's death: purpose. These babies needed her, and for the first time in years, she was needed in return. She whispered a Cherokee prayer of gratitude to the Creator and prepared their bottles, understanding that she had just embarked on the most important journey of her twilight years. The hardest part would be keeping them secret from everyone, including Sarah and Tommy, until she could figure out what came next. 3 weeks passed in a blur of sleepless nights and secret devotion. Ayanna had established a routine that would have challenged someone half her age: feeding every 2 hours around the clock, cleaning the makeshift nursery, and monitoring each kitten's development with the methodical precision of her nursing background. The cubs had doubled in size, their eyes fully open now and revealing the golden amber that would eventually replace their birth blue. Atlas had grown noticeably larger than his siblings, while Sage remained delicate but determined, often the last to finish her bottle but never giving up. The financial strain was becoming unbearable. Kitten milk replacer cost $85 per week at the pet store in town, forcing Ayanna to skip her blood pressure medication and survive on beans and cornbread. She'd sold Walter's vintage tool collection to a collector in Asheville, claiming she needed space, but the truth was, she needed money. Each lie to Sarah about her increased expenses felt like a small betrayal, but the alternative, watching 4 innocent lives slip away, was unthinkable. Tommy Riversong arrived unannounced on a Thursday morning, his official wildlife service truck rumbling up her gravel driveway just as Ayanna was sterilizing bottles in the kitchen sink. Panic shot through her chest as she quickly hid the evidence behind a dish towel and met him on the front porch, hoping her forced smile masked the terror racing through her veins. "Morning, Miss Ayanna," Tommy called out, his keen eyes immediately noting her obvious weight loss and the exhaustion etched in the lines around her eyes. "Just checking in after those poison reports we've been getting. Found any dead animals on your property?" The question hit too close to home. Ayanna's hands trembled slightly as she wiped them on her apron, remembering the mother bobcat's still form under the mountain laurel. "Nothing on my land directly," she managed, which was technically true since she'd found the poisoned bobcat just beyond her property line. Tommy studied her face with the practiced attention of someone trained to read deception. Something was off. The nervous energy, the way she kept glancing back toward the cabin, the faint but unmistakable scent of animal formula that clung to her clothes. As they talked about the weather and her garden, he noticed other telltale signs: the muddy footprints by her back door suggesting frequent trips to the woods, the unusual increase in her garbage that included empty milk containers, and most damning of all, the fine golden hairs clinging to her sweater that definitely didn't come from any domestic animal. When Ayanna excused herself to use the bathroom, Tommy's curiosity overcame his respect for privacy. He followed the sound of soft mewing to the spare bedroom door, which stood slightly ajar. What he saw inside stopped him cold: 4 healthy bobcat kittens playing in a makeshift enclosure, their distinctive tufted ears and spotted coats marking them unmistakably as protected wildlife. The federal violation was so enormous it took his breath away. "Miss Ayanna," he called quietly when she returned, his voice heavy with conflicted duty. "We need to talk." The confession tumbled out of her like water through a broken dam. She told him about finding the poisoned mother, about the desperate choice between law and life, about the sleepless nights and dwindling savings. But she didn't tell him everything. Not yet. The deepest truth, the one that made this act of defiance feel like penance rather than crime, remained locked in her heart. Tommy listened in stunned silence, watching this woman he'd known and respected for years reveal the depth of her law-breaking. As a federal wildlife officer, his duty was crystal clear: confiscate the animals immediately and file charges. But as someone who'd grown up on this reservation, who remembered Ayanna delivering his baby cousin during a blizzard when the roads were impassable, who knew her as a woman who'd devoted her life to healing rather than harming, he found himself caught between two incompatible loyalties. "You know what I have to do," he said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. "They'll die in a facility," Ayanna replied simply. "I'm a nurse, Tommy. I know what happens to orphaned wildlife in overcrowded rehabilitation centers. They become statistics. Here, they have a chance." The standoff stretched between them like a taut wire. Tommy's radio crackled with routine calls, reminding him of his official capacity. But something in Ayanna's eyes, a depth of pain that spoke to wounds far deeper than these 4 kittens, made him hesitate. There was a story here he didn't yet understand, a reason this gentlewoman was willing to risk everything for animals that would grow up to be apex predators. "There's something else," Ayanna said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something I've never told anyone, about why I can't let them die." She led him to Walter's old rocking chair on the porch, her arthritic hands shaking as she began the most difficult story of her life. 30 years ago, she'd been temporary guardian to a 5-year-old girl named Emma Stormcrow, whose parents had died in a car accident. Emma was Richard Stormcrow's little sister, a bright, curious child who loved exploring the woods behind Ayanna's cabin. One afternoon, Emma went missing. Ayanna continued, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "I found her unconscious near a bobcat den, with the mother bobcat standing over her. I thought, God help me, I thought the bobcat had attacked her. I called for help and Emma died on the way to the hospital." Tommy listened in growing horror as the story unfolded. The autopsy had revealed that Emma died of an undiagnosed congenital heart condition. She'd likely collapsed while exploring, and the mother bobcat, protective of her nearby kittens, had been trying to shield the unconscious child from other predators. But by then it was too late. The community believed a bobcat had killed their little girl, and Ayanna had allowed that misconception to stand rather than explain the complex truth. "Richard has hated me for 30 years, she whispered. "He thinks I was negligent, that I let his sister die. But the real truth is worse. I killed an innocent mother protecting her babies and a lost child. I've lived with that guilt every single day since." The revelation recontextualized everything. Tommy understood now why this elderly woman was willing to risk federal prosecution for 4 orphaned kittens. In her mind, this wasn't just about saving animals. It was about redemption, about finally doing right by a bobcat family after destroying one decades earlier. "I can't let them die, Tommy," Ayanna concluded. "Not when I have the knowledge and ability to save them. I won't make the same mistake twice." Tommy sat in stunned silence, wrestling with the weight of her confession. His duty as a wildlife officer warred with his growing understanding of the complex moral landscape before him. These weren't just illegally kept animals. They were Ayanna's attempt to balance a cosmic scale, to transform decades of guilt into an act of preservation. Finally, he made a decision that would change all their lives. "What if we did this legally?" he asked quietly. "What if I helped you?" Helped. Tommy's offer to help came with conditions that would test Ayanna's resolve in ways she hadn't anticipated. He agreed to provide medical supplies and guidance through his wildlife service connections, but only if she followed proper rehabilitation protocols designed to keep the cubs wild. This meant reducing human contact as they matured, building an appropriate outdoor enclosure, and accepting that the ultimate goal was their release back into the mountains. Most importantly, it meant keeping their existence secret from everyone else, including Sarah. "If anyone discovers what we're doing, it's not just your freedom at stake," Tommy warned during one of his evening visits. "I could lose my job, my certification, everything I've worked for. We're walking a tightrope over a very deep canyon." The cubs thrived under their combined care. By 6 weeks, they had tripled in size and were showing the distinctive personality traits that would define them as adults. Atlas, now clearly the largest, had appointed himself protector of the group, always positioning himself between his siblings and any perceived threat. When Tommy first entered their nursery, Atlas had stood his ground with a courage that was both impressive and heartbreaking in something so small. Luna demonstrated an intelligence that surprised even Tommy's professional experience. She learned to open simple latches within days, figured out how to manipulate the heating pad controls, and seemed to understand complex cause and effect relationships that suggested cognitive abilities beyond typical Bobcat development. "She's problem-solving at a level I've never seen," Tommy admitted, watching her teach her siblings to access a food puzzle he'd designed for older animals. River lived up to his name with boundless energy and curiosity that kept Ayana constantly vigilant. He was the first to attempt climbing, the first to show hunting instincts by stalking dust motes and shadows, and the first to escape from their enclosure, leading to a frantic hour-long search that ended with finding him asleep in Walter's old slipper under the bed. His adventurous spirit was both delightful and exhausting. Sage remained the gentlest of the four, often content to curl up near Ayana during feeding times, purring with a sound that vibrated through her tiny chest like a miniature engine. She was also the most observant, watching everything with those intelligent amber eyes, and seeming to understand human emotions in ways that defied scientific explanation. When Ayana was particularly tired or sad, Sage would press against her hand and purr until the woman's breathing slowed and relaxed. The financial burden continued to mount despite Tommy's help with supplies. Ayana's medical bills from her decades of nursing had accumulated into a crushing debt that her meager Social Security couldn't address. She'd already mortgaged the cabin twice, and the payments were becoming impossible to manage. The stress manifested in weight loss, insomnia, and a persistent cough that she attributed to allergies rather than acknowledge the deeper health issues she couldn't afford to treat. Anonymous help began arriving in mysterious ways. An envelope containing $500 in cash appeared in her mailbox with a note reading, "For the animals, from a friend." Bags of premium cat food were left on her porch overnight. A veterinary supply company called to say someone had prepaid an account in her name for wildlife rehabilitation supplies. When she questioned Tommy about these gifts, he denied any involvement, though his expression suggested he knew more than he was revealing. Sarah's weekly visits became exercises in careful deception. Ayana had become adept at hiding the evidence of her secret household, but her niece's trained social worker eye noticed changes that were harder to conceal. The exhaustion, the weight loss, the way her aunt's attention seemed divided even during their conversations, and most puzzling, the occasional animal hair on furniture despite Ayana's claims of only feeding stray cats outside. "Aunt Ayana, you're worrying me," Sarah said during one particularly difficult visit when she found her aunt asleep at the kitchen table at 2 in the afternoon. "You look like you haven't slept in weeks. What's really going on here?" The lie came easier now, polished by weeks of practice. "Just getting old, honey. Some nights are harder than others. The loneliness gets to me sometimes, and I find myself staying up too late reading or watching the birds." But Sarah's suspicions were growing. She'd found empty milk containers in amounts that seemed excessive for one elderly woman's coffee consumption, and she'd noticed an unusual number of towels hanging on the clothesline despite Ayana's claims of doing less laundry. The pieces didn't add up to a coherent picture, but they suggested secrets that made Sarah increasingly uncomfortable. By 3 months, the cubs had outgrown their indoor nursery and required the outdoor enclosure that Tommy had helped design and build. The construction project, supposedly for garden protection from deer, provided cover for creating a sophisticated habitat that would serve as a transitional space between domestic care and wild independence. The enclosure featured natural logs for climbing, hiding spots that mimicked den environments, and a design that would allow for gradual expansion as the cubs grew. Moving the cubs outside marked an emotional watershed for Ayana. For the first time since finding them, she couldn't hear their soft breathing through the bedroom wall or respond immediately to any distress calls. The separation anxiety she experienced was reminiscent of sending a child off to school, magnified by the knowledge that this was just the first step in a process that would ultimately take them away from her forever. The cubs adapted to their new environment with the resilience of wild animals, but they maintained their emotional connection to Ayana in ways that concerned Tommy from a professional standpoint. They would gather at the fence closest to the cabin whenever she appeared, following her movements with their eyes and calling to her with sounds that ranged from traditional bobcat vocalizations to something more akin to domestic cat meowing, a behavior that suggested they viewed her as part of their family unit rather than simply a food provider. This level of attachment isn't healthy for their eventual release, Tommy warned during one of their evening conferences. Wild bobcats should be showing fear or at least wariness toward humans by this age. These 4 act like you're their mother. I am their mother, Ayana replied simply. In every way that matters, I'm the only mother they've ever known. You can't expect me to simply turn off 3 months of love and care because a textbook says it's inappropriate. The comment revealed the fundamental tension that would define the next phase of their journey. Ayana's maternal attachment to the cubs was deepening even as the professional requirements for their rehabilitation demanded increasing distance. She found herself sitting by their enclosure in the evenings, reading aloud from whatever book she was enjoying, watching their alert faces as if they understood every word. Sometimes she would speak to them in Cherokee, sharing stories her grandmother had told her about the relationship between humans and animals in the time before the world became so divided. Tommy's concerns proved prophetic when Sarah made an unannounced visit and nearly discovered the secret that had consumed Ayana's life for months. She arrived earlier than usual, finding her aunt sitting by the outdoor enclosure with a book in her lap, apparently reading to empty space. But Sarah's sharp eyes caught movement in the shadows, large, cat-like shapes that were definitely not the stray cats her aunt claimed to be feeding. "Aunt Ayana, what exactly am I looking at?" Sarah asked, moving closer to the enclosure before her aunt could deflect or distract. The moment of truth had arrived sooner than anyone expected. 4 juvenile bobcats, now weighing nearly 20 pounds each, and displaying the unmistakable features of their species, emerged from their hiding spots to investigate the newcomer. Their lack of fear toward humans was immediately apparent, as was their obvious health and the sophisticated nature of their habitat. "Dear God," Sarah whispered, understanding immediately the magnitude of what her aunt had been hiding. "These are bobcats, wild bobcats. Do you have any idea what you've done?" The confrontation that followed revealed the depth of Sarah's fear for her aunt's welfare and the legal consequences of harboring protected wildlife. As a social worker, she understood the federal regulations that Ayana was violating and the potential penalties that could include substantial fines and imprisonment. More immediately, she recognized the physical toll that caring for 4 large predators was taking on a 72-year-old woman with limited resources and declining health. "This has to stop," Sarah declared with the authority of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions about vulnerable people's welfare. "These animals need to go to a proper facility, and you need medical attention. This is exactly the kind of poor judgment that proves you can't continue living independently." The threat of forced institutionalization hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Ayanna understood that Sarah's concerns came from love, but the prospect of losing both her freedom and her cubs simultaneously felt like a death sentence. She had found purpose and meaning in caring for these animals, had rediscovered a sense of maternal fulfillment that had been missing from her life since Walter's death. Tommy arrived to find the 2 women locked in a standoff that threatened to destroy everything they had worked to build. Sarah demanded immediate action to remove the bobcats and evaluate Ayanna's competency to live independently. Ayanna refused to surrender the cubs while they were still dependent on human care for survival. The professional in Tommy knew that Sarah was legally and ethically correct, but the man who had spent months watching Ayanna pour her heart into saving these animals couldn't bring himself to support their immediate removal. "Give us 30 days, he proposed as a compromise. "The cubs are almost ready for transfer to a proper rehabilitation facility anyway. Let Miss Ayanna complete what she started, ensure they're fully prepared for the transition, and then we'll arrange for their placement somewhere they can learn final independent skills." Sarah agreed reluctantly, but with conditions that would prove even more challenging than the secret-keeping had been. She would visit weekly to monitor both her aunt's health and the animals' welfare. Any sign of decline in either would result in immediate intervention. Most critically, she would begin researching assisted living options for Ayanna, making it clear that the cub's departure would mark the end of her aunt's isolated independence. The 30-day countdown had begun, and with it, the most difficult chapter of Ayanna's relationship with her adopted children. She would have to prepare them for a world without her while preparing herself for a world without them, all under the watchful eye of a niece whose love was indistinguishable from the threat of institutional control. As autumn began to paint the Smoky Mountains in shades of gold and crimson, 4 young bobcats played in their enclosure while an elderly Cherokee woman watched from her porch, knowing that every sunset brought them closer to a separation that would break her heart but set them free. The 30-day countdown became a period of profound transformation that no one had anticipated. As autumn deepened in the Smoky Mountains, the 4 bobcats underwent changes that went far beyond their physical development. Now weighing 35 pounds each and displaying the full majesty of their species, they had developed hunting skills that impressed even Tommy's professional eye. But it was their emotional intelligence and cooperative behavior that defied every textbook on wild animal rehabilitation. Atlas had grown into his role as protector with a sophistication that bordered on military precision. He established patrol patterns around the enclosure perimeter, positioned himself strategically during feeding times to ensure his siblings ate safely, and demonstrated an understanding of threat assessment that suggested cognitive abilities far beyond typical bobcat intelligence. When Sarah visited, he would watch her intently from a distance, neither aggressive nor fearful, but clearly evaluating her intentions toward Ayanna. Luna's problem-solving abilities had evolved into something resembling tactical thinking. She had learned to manipulate multiple latch systems, coordinate with her siblings to achieve goals none could accomplish alone, and most remarkably, she had begun displaying what could only be described as teaching behaviors. Tommy observed her demonstrating hunting techniques to Sage, correcting River's stalking posture, and organizing group activities with a level of leadership that challenged fundamental assumptions about bobcat social structure. River's boundless energy had matured into reconnaissance skills that would have impressed a military scout. He explored every inch of their territory daily, cataloged changes in scents and sounds, and had developed an early warning system of vocalizations that alerted the group to approaching humans, weather changes, and potential prey opportunities. His ability to navigate complex terrain silently had become so refined that he could move through dense underbrush without disturbing a single leaf. Sage remained the emotional center of the group, but her gentle nature had evolved into something more complex. She served as mediator during conflicts between her siblings, comforter during stress, and most significantly, as the primary communicator with Ayanna. She had developed a vocabulary of sounds that seemed specifically designed for human interaction, ranging from soft chirps that clearly meant hello to urgent calls that summoned help when needed. The mystery of their anonymous benefactor was solved when Richard Stormcrow arrived unannounced on a crisp October morning, his expensive sedan looking out of place on the gravel driveway. Ayanna recognized him immediately, despite the 30 years that had passed since Emma's death. Time had silvered his hair and added lines to his face, but his eyes still held the same haunted intensity she remembered from that terrible day when his world had shattered. "I know what you're hiding back there," he said without preamble, his voice carrying the weight of decades of suppressed emotion. "I've been watching this place for months, wondering what kind of sick game you were playing with my money." The revelation that Richard had been the anonymous donor sent shockwaves through Ayanna's understanding of the past 30 years. He explained, with barely controlled emotion, how guilt had tormented him alongside anger. While publicly blaming her for Emma's death, privately, he had wrestled with the knowledge that his own negligence as an older brother had contributed to the tragedy. He should have been watching Emma more carefully, should have taught her better about Wood's safety, should have been the protector she needed. "Every dollar I sent was blood money," he continued, his voice breaking. "Payment for 30 years of cowardice, for letting you carry blame that belonged to both of us. But when I learned you were risking everything for bobcats, the same animals I've hated for 3 decades, I had to see for myself what kind of madness was driving you." The confrontation took place while the 4 cubs watched from their enclosure, sensing the emotional tension but remaining calm due to Ayanna's presence. Richard's first glimpse of them triggered a visceral reaction that surprised everyone present. Instead of the rage or disgust they expected, his face crumpled with something that looked almost like recognition. "They're beautiful," he whispered, stepping closer to the fence despite Tommy's warning about maintaining distance. "Emma would have loved them." The observation opened a floodgate of memories that neither Richard nor Ayanna had allowed themselves to access for 30 years. They talked through the afternoon and into the evening, sharing stories about Emma that revealed a complex, vibrant child whose death had frozen both adults in patterns of guilt and recrimination. For the first time, they discussed the autopsy results that had revealed Emma's congenital heart condition, the hidden time bomb that would have claimed her life regardless of that day's events. "I've spent 3 decades hating the wrong target," Richard admitted as darkness settled over the mountains. "The bobcat didn't kill Emma. Neither did you. Neither did I. But we've all been paying the price for a tragedy that was nobody's fault." The healing that began that evening would prove crucial in the days that followed, because Richard's reconciliation with Ayanna coincided with the emergence of a threat neither had anticipated. Dr. Marcus Webb, a federal wildlife enforcement officer based in Atlanta, had received anonymous reports about illegal wildlife keeping on the Cherokee Reservation. His investigation had led him to focus on Ayanna's property, and his arrival would test every relationship and alliance they had built. Webb appeared on a Tuesday morning with the full authority of federal law behind him, accompanied by 2 assistants and a truck equipped for animal transport. His investigation had been thorough. He knew about the cubs' existence, their approximate ages, and enough details about their care to make denial impossible. What he didn't know was the complex web of relationships and emotions that had developed around these four animals. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step away from the enclosure," Webb announced with the practiced authority of someone accustomed to compliance. "We have warrants for the immediate confiscation of 4 illegally kept bobcats and authorization to arrest you for violations of the Endangered Species Act." The standoff that followed would become legendary in Cherokee community memory. Ayanna refused to move away from the enclosure where her cubs had retreated to the far corner, clearly sensing the threat these strangers represented. Tommy stepped forward to assert his wildlife service credentials, but Webb outranked him significantly and dismissed his protests about proper rehabilitation procedures. Sarah found herself in the impossible position of watching her aunt face federal arrest while knowing that Ayanna's actions, however illegal, had saved 4 lives that would otherwise have been lost. The cubs themselves seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, gathering near the fence closest to Ayanna and vocalizing in ways that sounded almost like protests. Richard's intervention proved decisive. His wealth and connections in Cherokee Nation politics gave him influence that Webb couldn't dismiss, but more importantly, his offer to fund a proper rehabilitation facility on his own land provided a legal alternative to immediate confiscation. The cubs could be transferred to a legitimate wildlife sanctuary that he would establish and fund, allowing them to complete their development under proper protocols while avoiding the trauma of separation from their mountain environment. "These animals have been raised by someone who understands their needs," Richard argued with surprising passion. "Throwing them into an overcrowded federal facility hundreds of miles away serves no conservation purpose. Let them finish growing up in the mountains where they belong under proper supervision." The negotiations stretched through the entire day, involving conference calls with federal supervisors, Cherokee Nation legal counsel, and wildlife biology experts who had to evaluate the cubs' condition and development. The cubs themselves seemed to sense the importance of these discussions, remaining visible near the fence and displaying the healthy behaviors that supported Richard's arguments about their proper care. The compromise reached that evening satisfied federal requirements while acknowledging the unique circumstances of the case. The cubs would be transferred to a temporary facility Richard would construct on his adjacent property, staffed by certified wildlife rehabilitators and overseen by federal monitors. Ayanna would face no criminal charges, but would be prohibited from further wildlife rehabilitation activities. Most painfully for her, she would have supervised visitation rights only, ending her role as their primary caregiver. The cubs seemed to understand that change was coming even before the human arrangements were finalized. Their behavior shifted over the following days, becoming more restless and vocal, spending longer periods watching the woods beyond their enclosure. Luna began testing the fence boundaries more frequently, not in an attempt to escape, but as if preparing for expanded territory. Atlas increased his protective vigilance, and River began longer reconnaissance expeditions to the far corners of their space. Sage's response was the most heartbreaking for Ayanna. The gentlest of the 4 began bringing gifts to the fence. Interesting stones, colorful leaves, small bones from their feeding prey, arranging them in neat piles near where Ayanna usually sat. The behavior suggested a level of emotional sophistication that made their approaching separation even more painful. The transfer was scheduled for the following Monday, giving everyone a final weekend to prepare for changes that would reshape all their lives. As Ayanna sat with her cubs on their last evening together as a family, she whispered Cherokee blessings over each of them, telling them stories about the mountains they would soon explore as free adults, and promising them that love transcends physical separation. None of them could have imagined that nature itself was about to intervene in ways that would test every relationship, challenge every assumption, and ultimately reveal the true depth of the bonds they had forged together. The tragedy began with a lie that seemed inconsequential at the time. Richard Stormcrow had told Dr. Webb and the federal authorities that his hastily constructed rehabilitation facility was complete and ready for the Cubs' transfer. But in reality, the complex legal requirements and construction permits had delayed the project by weeks. Faced with Webb's inflexible Monday deadline, Richard made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He would temporarily house the Cubs in a converted warehouse on his casino property until the proper facility was finished. The warehouse space, though large and secure, lacked the sophisticated environmental controls and safety systems that four intelligent, powerful predators required. Richard's construction crew worked frantically through the weekend to install proper fencing, ventilation, and feeding areas, but they were racing against time and cutting corners that would prove fatal. Sunday evening brought an unseasonable heat wave that pushed temperatures into the mid-80s, unusual for late October in the mountains. The warehouse's inadequate cooling system struggled against the combination of external heat and the stress-induced body heat of four frightened animals suddenly removed from their familiar environment. By midnight, the temperature inside had climbed to dangerous levels, but the automated monitoring system Richard had installed was still awaiting calibration by technicians who wouldn't arrive until morning. Ayanna, spending her first night in 8 months without the sound of her cubs nearby, couldn't sleep. Something felt wrong in her bones, the kind of deep unease that Cherokee elders called spirit warning. She sat on her porch in Walter's old rocking chair, staring toward the distant lights of Richard's casino complex, fighting the urge to drive over and check on her babies despite the restraining order that prohibited her from approaching them. At 2:47 a.m., the warehouse's primary ventilation fan failed. The backup system, hastily installed and improperly wired, never activated. Within an hour, the temperature had climbed to over 90 degrees, and the air had become thick with humidity and carbon dioxide. The four cubs, already stressed by their unfamiliar surroundings and separation from Ayanna, began showing signs of heat exhaustion. River, the smallest and most active of the four, was the first to collapse. His siblings, displaying the cooperative intelligence that had developed over months of living together, tried to help by dragging him to what little shade existed in the warehouse corners. Luna, with her problem-solving abilities, began clawing at the ventilation grates, somehow understanding that fresh air was needed but unable to access the controls that could save them. Atlas took charge with the protective instincts that had defined him since birth, positioning himself near the warehouse's single window while making increasingly desperate vocalizations that would have summoned help if anyone had been close enough to hear them. Sage, weakened but still thinking of others, curled around River's unconscious form, trying to provide comfort even as her own breathing became labored. The security guard who discovered them at dawn was a young Cherokee man named David Crow Feather, who had grown up hearing stories about Ayanna's legendary nursing skills. He took one look at the four bobcats, two unconscious, two barely responsive, and made a decision that violated every protocol Richard had established. Instead of calling his supervisor or waiting for veterinary authorities, he loaded all four animals into his pickup truck and drove directly to Ayanna's cabin. Ayanna emerged from her house to find David standing beside his truck with tears streaming down his face. "Miss Ayanna, I know I'm not supposed to bring them here, but they're dying. The warehouse got too hot, and I don't think they're going to make it to the veterinary clinic in town." The sight that greeted her was more devastating than anything she had experienced since Walter's death. River lay motionless in the truck bed, his breathing so shallow it was barely detectable. Luna was conscious but panting heavily, her eyes glazed with the unmistakable signs of severe dehydration. Atlas struggled to lift his head when he heard Ayana's voice, while Sage made a weak sound that broke the old woman's heart into pieces. Every instinct screamed at her to act, but the legal restrictions were clear. She was prohibited from providing care to these animals under penalty of federal prosecution. For a moment that stretched like eternity, she stood frozen between the law that forbade her from helping and the maternal love that made their suffering unbearable. "David, help me get them inside," she said finally, her voice steady despite the terror in her heart. "I don't care what happens to me. I won't watch them die." The next 4 hours became a desperate battle for 4 lives that had become more precious to Ayana than her own freedom. She converted her living room into an emergency veterinary unit, using every skill from 4 decades of nursing to address dehydration, hyperthermia, and the beginning stages of organ failure. River required immediate IV fluids, which she administered using supplies Tommy had left for emergencies. Luna needed electrolyte replacement and cooling measures that involved ice baths and fan circulation. Atlas, despite his own distress, seemed to understand that his siblings needed help first. He positioned himself where he could watch Ayana work, occasionally making soft sounds that seemed designed to encourage her efforts. Sage, though barely conscious, pressed against Ayana's hand whenever she came near, as if drawing strength from the contact. Tommy arrived within an hour of David's frantic phone call, bringing medical supplies and the grim news that Richard was already facing federal charges for the warehouse incident. Dr. Webb was en route from Atlanta with a full investigation team, and there was talk of criminal prosecution for everyone involved in what was being termed gross negligence resulting in animal endangerment. "Miss Ayana, you know they're going to arrest you for this," Tommy said quietly, watching her monitor River's vital signs with the focused intensity of a trained medical professional. The restraining order was explicit. No contact with the animals under any circumstances. "Then they'll arrest me," she replied without looking up from the IV line she was adjusting. "These babies didn't ask to be put in that death trap. If saving their lives costs me my freedom, that's a price I'm willing to pay." Sarah arrived as the afternoon shadows lengthened, bringing the devastating news that River had developed complications that were beyond Ayana's ability to treat. His kidneys were showing signs of failure, and he needed dialysis equipment that existed only at major veterinary hospitals hours away. The decision to transport him would mean admitting defeat and surrendering all 4 cubs to federal custody, but keeping him at the cabin would likely mean watching him die. The choice that no mother should ever have to make hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Ayana looked at River's still form, then at his 3 siblings who were showing improvement under her care, and felt the weight of impossible decisions crushing her spirit. She had found these cubs as orphaned babies facing certain death, had devoted 8 months of her life to raising them into magnificent animals, and now federal incompetence had brought them back to the brink of mortality. "We transport River," she decided, her voice breaking with the words. "But Atlas, Luna, and Sage stay here until they're completely stable. If Dr. Webb wants to arrest me, he can do it while I'm saving their lives." The convoy that departed for the veterinary hospital that evening represented the convergence of love, law, and loss that had defined this entire journey. River, unconscious in the back of Tommy's official vehicle, with Ayana maintaining his IV line despite her arthritis, was racing toward either salvation or a final goodbye. Richard, following in his own car, carried the crushing weight of knowing his shortcuts had nearly killed the animals he'd grown to love. Sarah drove behind them, torn between supporting her aunt's heroic efforts and fearing the legal consequences that would surely follow. As they descended from the mountains toward the lights of Asheville, none of them could have imagined that this dark night would ultimately lead to revelations that would transform their understanding of love, family, and the unbreakable bonds that connect all living things across the boundaries of species, law, and even death itself. The veterinary hospital's emergency room buzzed with controlled chaos as River's limp form was rushed into intensive care. Dr. Jennifer Harrison, the lead veterinary nephrologist, took one look at his blood work and delivered the news that shattered what remained of Ayanna's composure. Acute kidney failure, complicated by severe dehydration and hyperthermia. His chances of survival were less than 30%, and even if he pulled through, permanent organ damage was likely. "I need you to understand," Dr. Harrison said gently, "that we're looking at weeks of dialysis, assuming his body responds to treatment. The cost will be substantial, and there's no guarantee of success." Richard stepped forward without hesitation. "Money isn't a factor. Do whatever it takes." But as they waited through the agonizing hours of River's first dialysis session, Tommy received a call that changed everything. "Doctor." Webb had arrived at Ayanna's cabin with a full federal enforcement team demanding immediate surrender of the remaining 3 cubs. When he found them gone, he'd issued warrants for everyone involved in what he termed a conspiracy to obstruct federal wildlife enforcement. "He's threatening to charge you with kidnapping federal property," Tommy reported, his voice tight with anger. "And he's got jurisdiction to make it stick." The revelation that would reshape everyone's understanding of the past 8 months came from an unexpected source. David Crow Feather, the security guard who'd rescued the cubs from the warehouse, had been reviewing the facility's security footage to document the system failures that had caused the crisis. What he discovered was a timestamp discrepancy that revealed a shocking truth. The ventilation failure hadn't been accidental. "Miss Ayanna," David said quietly, approaching her in the hospital waiting room with a tablet displaying the security footage. "You need to see this." The video showed a figure entering the warehouse at 1:30 a.m., 2 hours before the ventilation system failed. The person moved with deliberate purpose, accessing the electrical panel and making adjustments that weren't visible in the low-resolution recording. But the timestamp and the distinctive walking pattern were enough to identify the saboteur, Dr. Marcus Webb himself. "He caused this," Ayanna whispered, the pieces falling into place with horrifying clarity. "He deliberately tried to kill them." The deeper investigation that followed revealed a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of federal wildlife enforcement. Webb had been systematically targeting successful wildlife rehabilitation cases, particularly those involving predator species, as part of what internal documents called deterrent enforcement. The theory was that making examples of high-profile cases would discourage others from attempting illegal wildlife rescue. Richard's wealth and connections enabled a legal response that Webb hadn't anticipated. Within hours, a team of federal attorneys was reviewing evidence that suggested not just criminal sabotage, but a pattern of abuse of federal authority spanning several years. Webb's other cases began unraveling as witnesses came forward with stories of suspicious system failures, convenient equipment malfunctions, and animals dying in federal custody under circumstances that had never been properly investigated. "He's been murdering animals to prove a point," Richard said, his voice shaking with rage as he reviewed the evidence. "How many others died because this psychopath wanted to send a message?" The legal reversal was swift and complete. Webb was arrested on charges ranging from animal cruelty to conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of federal authority. The warrants against Ayanna and the others were vacated, and a federal judge issued an emergency order placing the cubs under Cherokee Nation protective custody, pending a complete review of the case. But while justice was being served in courtrooms and government offices, River fought a more personal battle in the ICU. His kidney function showed minimal improvement despite 2 days of intensive treatment, and Dr. Harrison's updates grew increasingly grim. The toxins that had built up in his system during those critical hours in the warehouse had damaged more than just his kidneys. His liver was struggling, his heart rhythm was irregular, and his neurological responses suggested potential brain damage. Ayanna maintained a bedside vigil that hospital policy should have prohibited, but the extraordinary circumstances of the case had generated media attention that made the facility reluctant to enforce normal visitor restrictions. She sat beside River's unconscious form for 48 hours straight, monitoring his breathing, adjusting his blankets, and whispering Cherokee prayers that seemed to be the only thing keeping both of them anchored to hope. On the third night, as River's condition continued to deteriorate despite all medical intervention, Ayanna made a decision that surprised everyone who thought they understood her character. She asked Tommy to bring Atlas, Luna, and Sage to the hospital. "They need to say goodbye," she explained when the veterinary staff protested the unprecedented request. "If River doesn't make it, his siblings need to understand what happened. Animals grieve too, and they deserve the chance for closure." The reunion in the hospital's specialized wildlife treatment room was both heartbreaking and beautiful. Atlas, Luna, and Sage approached their unconscious brother with a gentleness that silenced every observer. They sniffed him carefully, made soft vocalizations that seemed designed to wake him, and then settled into a protective formation around his treatment table that mirrored their behavior as young cubs. Luna, with her problem-solving intelligence, seemed to understand the function of the medical equipment. She positioned herself where she could observe the monitors without interfering with the machinery, watching the readouts with an intensity that suggested comprehension. Atlas took his familiar guard position, alert to every sound and movement in the room. Sage, true to her nature, simply pressed as close to River as the medical equipment would allow, purring with a sound that resonated through the room like a prayer made audible. The miracle that followed defied medical explanation but not emotional logic. Within hours of his siblings' arrival, River's kidney function began to improve. His heart rhythm stabilized, his breathing deepened, and his neurological responses showed marked improvement. Dr. Harrison, a scientist by training and temperament, struggled to explain the correlation between family presence and physiological recovery. "I've seen animals respond to familiar voices and scents," she admitted. "But this level of improvement suggests something beyond normal medical parameters. It's as if his body was waiting for permission to heal." The breakthrough came on the fourth day when River opened his eyes and immediately searched for his siblings. Finding them nearby, he made a sound that was part relief, part recognition, and part pure joy. Atlas responded with protective nuzzling, Luna chirped her distinctive greeting, and Sage curled against him with the gentleness that had defined her from birth. Watching this reunion, Ayanna finally understood the truth that would reshape her perspective on everything that had happened. These 4 animals weren't just orphans she had rescued. They were a family unit whose bonds transcended the usual understanding of wildlife behavior. Their cooperative intelligence, their emotional sophistication, and their capacity for loyalty weren't anomalies to be explained away by scientific theories. They were expressions of love that crossed species boundaries and challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness, emotion, and family. The federal investigation that followed Webb's arrest revealed a network of corruption that had been systematically destroying successful wildlife rehabilitation programs across the Southeast. His deterrent enforcement philosophy had resulted in the deaths of hundreds of animals and the prosecution of dozens of wildlife rescuers whose only crime had been caring too much about suffering creatures. But the most shocking revelation came from Webb's personal files, which contained detailed surveillance reports on Ayanna dating back 15 years. He had been monitoring her since Walter's death, tracking her financial struggles, her health issues, and her increasing isolation. The anonymous reports that had triggered his investigation weren't from concerned citizens, they were part of a calculated campaign to destroy someone he viewed as a symbol of misguided compassion. "He chose you specifically," Richard explained, reviewing the documents with a mixture of horror and admiration. "Out of all the wildlife cases in his jurisdiction, he targeted you because he saw your bond with these cubs as the most egregious example of humans interfering with natural order. He wanted to make your failure spectacular enough to deter others. Instead, Webb's cruelty had created something unprecedented. A legal precedent that recognized the emotional bonds between humans and wildlife as a factor in rehabilitation decisions, a Cherokee Nation wildlife sanctuary that would serve as a model for indigenous conservation programs, and most importantly, proof that love could triumph over bureaucratic hatred when ordinary people chose to act with extraordinary courage." As River continued his recovery, surrounded by his family, human and feline alike, the foundations were being laid for a future none of them could have imagined when this journey began with 4 orphaned cubs and one lonely woman's decision to choose love over law. 1 year later, Ayanna Whitefeather sat in her favorite rocking chair on the porch of her rebuilt cabin, watching the most extraordinary sight of her 73 years. 4 magnificent bobcats moved through the meadow beyond her garden with the grace and power of their wild heritage, but their behavior was unlike anything documented in wildlife literature. They had formed a family unit that defied scientific explanation, hunting cooperatively, sharing territory harmoniously, and maintaining social bonds that should have dissolved upon reaching maturity. The Cherokee Wildlife Sanctuary that had risen from the ashes of tragedy now sprawled across 500 acres of pristine mountain wilderness, funded by Richard Stormcrow's estate and protected by Cherokee Nation sovereignty. Richard had lived just long enough to see the sanctuary's dedication ceremony, passing peacefully in his sleep after reconciling not only with Ayanna, but with his own tormented past. His final act had been establishing a trust fund that would ensure the sanctuary's operation in perpetuity. Atlas, now weighing 45 pounds of solid muscle, had become the sanctuary's unofficial ambassador, allowing supervised educational visits from schoolchildren who left with a new understanding of the intelligence and emotional depth of wild predators. Luna's problem-solving abilities had attracted attention from animal behaviorists worldwide, contributing to research that was revolutionizing the understanding of feline cognition. River, fully recovered from his near-death experience, served as living proof that love could triumph over medical odds. Sage remained the emotional heart of their family, the bridge between wild and domestic that had made their unique lifestyle possible. Sarah Moonwalker Riversong, now married to Tommy and living in a cabin on the sanctuary grounds, had abandoned her plans to institutionalize her aunt upon witnessing the profound healing that had occurred for all involved. Her 2 teenage sons had found purpose as junior wildlife educators, learning Cherokee traditions alongside modern conservation techniques. The evening ritual that had become sacred to them all began as sunset painted the mountains gold. Ayanna would sit on her porch with whatever book she was reading, and the 4 bobcats would emerge from the forest to settle within listening distance. Sometimes she read Cherokee stories passed down through generations, sometimes contemporary wildlife research, sometimes simple poetry that seemed to soothe both human and animal souls. "Mitakuye oyasing," she whispered into the mountain air, as 4 pairs of amber eyes reflected the dying light. "We are all related." The circle that had begun with orphaned cubs and a lonely woman had expanded to encompass an entire community, proving that families come in all forms, and love recognizes no boundaries between species, age, or expectation. In the distance, a new generation of bobcat kittens played under their parents' watchful eyes, wild and free, but forever touched by the memory of extraordinary love. At 72, Ayanna Whitefeather thought her days of nurturing and being needed were over. Like so many of us in our golden years, she faced the quiet desperation of feeling invisible, forgotten, with too much love left to give and nowhere to put it. Her Social Security barely covered expenses, her health was failing, and her niece was planning to put her in assisted living. Sound familiar? But when 4 orphaned bobcat cubs appeared at her doorstep, everything changed. Despite breaking federal law and risking imprisonment, Ayanna chose love over safety and discovered that our greatest purpose often arrives when we least expect it. These weren't just animals she saved. They became the family that saved her right back. When federal agents tried to destroy what she'd built, when a warehouse fire nearly killed her cubs, when bureaucratic cruelty threatened everything precious, love conquered all. Today, at 73, Ayanna runs a wildlife sanctuary, mentors young people, and has proven that our most meaningful chapters can begin long after others think we're finished writing our story. Your age isn't your limit. It's your launching pad for extraordinary love. What dream did you put aside that might still be calling to you? Have you ever felt invisible, only to discover you had more to give than you imagined? Share your story below. We'd love to hear how you found new purpose or hope in your golden years.